All right, back to chapter 14. 1 hour later. At last, the ash blizzard stopped. A thick coating of the warm flakes covered their heads and shoulders. Jess spit and coughed and wiped her eyes. The sky had lightened up. Finally, she could see well enough to climb through the tangle of limbs that covered the hole. She made her way up until she was high enough to see the forest, except it was no longer a forest. It was a graveyard of fallen trees. Every single tree was down, thousands and thousands of trees. The force of the blast and the surge had ripped most of them right out of the ground, 200-foot trees knocked over like popsicle sticks. Some had been uprooted, others snapped like twigs. If Jess and the twins hadn't been deep in the hole, they all would have been crushed. The cabin was smashed under a huge fir tree. Everything was covered with a thick coating of gray ash. But there was a sight even worse than the ruined forest, the mountain. With trees down, Jess now had a perfect view of St. Helens, or what was left of St. Helens. It looked as though it had been smashed by a giant hammer. Its sparkling peak was gone. In its place was a gaping black mouth vomiting up smoke. Jess had never seen anything so hideous. She slammed her eyes shut and turned away. She climbed back down into the hole again, and now she could finally really see the boys. Their faces were plastered white with ash and smeared with blood. They looked like two battered ghosts. Sam was staring down. Jess followed his gaze to his thigh. His pants were torn. What was that on his leg? It didn't look like skin. It looked like ripped up, blackened, like burned meat. Jess gasped, "Oh, Sam!" And then she looked at Eddie. She couldn't see his wounds, but from the glazed look in his eyes, she could tell that he was badly hurt, too. Both boys were shivering. They needed to find help, and now. But how? The boys couldn't stand, and Jess wouldn't be able to carry even one of them out. It was hopeless. They would have to sit here and wait for help to come. Jess looked up, praying that she'd see Mr. Rowan peering down into the hole. But how would he get to them? It would take hours, even days, for anyone to make it through the maze of fallen trees. Jess had to get help. But what if there was another eruption? What if another fiery hurricane swept over the forest? What if she got lost? 100 terrible questions swirled through her mind, and none had answers. But that didn't matter, Jess realized. "I'm going to get help," she said, fighting back tears. "I will be back very soon." The boys didn't seem to hear her. Both seemed to be drifting away. Sam's eyes were closed. He was shivering harder now. Jess gently took Sam's cold hand and laid it on her palm. She lifted Eddie's and put it on top of Sam's. She rested her other hand on top of Eddie's. She gripped both boys' hands tightly with her own. "All for one," she said, "and one for all." For the first time, Jess really understood what these words meant. Jess would do anything to help these boys. She would even face the volcano by herself. Chapter 15. But which way would she go? Jess looked around, trying to understand where she was. The trail was gone. Nothing looked familiar. It was as though she'd crash landed on a distant planet, a smoking, ash covered land. The only landmarks were the smashed shack and the mountain. Dad had taught her to use the sun as a guide, but the sun was blotted out by the ash and smoke. Jess decided that if she walked with the volcano on her left, she should at least be heading back toward the parking lot. Then maybe she could find Mr. Rowan. If she couldn't, at least she'd be close to the road. It was so hot that her clothes were sticking to her sweat-soaked skin. Jess stripped off her sweatshirt and dropped it over a branch. Then she took a breath and set out. She walked between fallen trees, and when there was no room between the trees, she climbed up and walked along their trunks. Everything was covered with inches of ash, and in some spots it was very hot. The air smelled like rotten eggs and smoke. Her back throbbed with pain. But even worse was the thirst. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue swollen and sandpaper dry. She hadn't had a sip of water since she'd left home. How long ago was that? Just this morning, this forest had been crisscrossed by creeks filled with clear, rushing water. On her camping trips with Dad, they'd scooped up water white from streams and gulped it down without a worry. But now every stream she passed was ruined. The ash had turned the sparkling water to thick, gray sludge that stank of sulphur. Just the thought of trying to swallow a mouthful was nauseating. The sounds of the volcano pounded in her ears. It roared, it thundered, it boomed. Bolts of lightning shot through the churning cloud above. Her footsteps kicked up clouds of ash that burned her eyes. But Jess ignored the pain and the thirst and the volcano's roar. She fought the swirl of terrifying thoughts that screamed through her mind. Instead, she pictured Dad's hopeful eyes. She imagined her great grandfather, Clive Marlowe, tramping through these very woods alone when he was just a few years older than Jess. She tried to hear Mom's voice. Whatever happens, you and I will make it through. But what really kept her feet moving was Sam and Eddie, her best friends. For as long as Jess could remember, they'd been right there with her. In those terrible months after Dad died, the twins had hardly ever left her side. They'd even slept on the floor of her room. She pictured their freckled faces, imagined the feel of their hands. Jess stumbled along for hours. For miles, she was sure. The parking lot was nowhere in sight. She was afraid she might be walking in circles. And then she came into a big field, a place she'd never seen before. And then that's when she realized she was completely lost. She crouched down on the hot, ashy ground, too exhausted to even cry. Every inch of her body ached. Her lungs burned from the ash. She had never imagined that she could be so thirsty. If only she could sleep for a while, everything would be better when she woke up. The sky would be blue again. The mountain would be quiet. All of this would be over. She left her eyes drift closed. She had the feeling of letting go, of floating away. The pain and thundering noise faded. No! She forced herself to stand up. What was she thinking? She had to keep going. She had to find help for the twins. She could not give up. And that's when she noticed a new sound. Not a roar, or a boom, or a whoosh. It was a flat, 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 flat. This book is filled with automatopoeia, boys and girls. A helicopter. Jess leaped to her feet and searched the sky. And there it was, a yellow chopper, flying in circles. She jumped up and waved, "Hey, hey, here I am!" But of course they couldn't hear her. And she was so covered with ash, she was just another speck of gray in the endless ash sea. How would they see her? The helicopter disappeared, and then it circled back a minute later. Jess jumped up and waved, but it flew away again. The pilot couldn't see her. What could Jess do? How could she get their attention before they flew away? And then it came to her. She found a big branch and snapped it off of a stick covered with leaves. She used it to sweep the ground around her, to create a huge cloud of ash that rose up like a smoke signal. And then she ran out in front of it, waving her arms. The helicopter slowed. It swooped down a bit and hovered over her. A man leaned out and waved. She shouted through a bullhorn, "We're coming down for you!" A wave of relief almost knocked Jess to the ground. The thwack, 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 thwack got louder and louder until it drowned out the sound of the volcano. The wind from the propeller kicked up so much ash that Jess could barely see. But moments later, a man in a bright orange vest appeared out of the cloud. He knelt down. "You okay?" he shouted. Jess didn't answer for a second, but then she nodded. She was okay. He helped Jess up and started to lead her to the chopper. "No, I can't leave my friends here. They're hurt. We have to get them. Where are they?" Jess turned and pointed to the wasteland all around them. "Somewhere out there." "Okay, let's get up into the air. You're going to help us find them." And so, minutes later, Jess was strapped into the back seat of a four-seat helicopter. The pilot was up front and the man in the vest was next to her. He gave her a thermos of water and big earphones to protect her ears from the engine noise. She looked out the window, combing the ground with her eyes. But everything looked the same. ash-covered trees as far as she could see. The air was filled with smoke. It was almost impossible to see anything. How would she ever spot the twins? But then Jess saw it, a flash of red. Her sweatshirt! Her heart leaped up. There! There they are! Jess cried. The man tapped the pilot's shoulder and pointed down. The helicopter swooped around and headed for the twins. She had found them.